Okay, and this simply repeats what I said before, but I can go into a little bit more detail. Um, Recognized order, which was the first option on the previous slide. Uh, there are four basic types of order for paragraphs. I'll talk more about them in some detail with examples in a little bit. But space, time, deductive, and inductive order. Now, with inductive order, you are not going to be using that in this class. Inductive order is an order in which the details of the essay lead to a generalization, which is, the details of a paragraph lead to the generalization, which is the topic sentence, meaning that the topic sentence would come at the end of the paragraph. While this is certainly a legitimate way of organizing a paragraph, I do not want you doing that in this class for reasons I think I've already talked about. Now, in addition to that, another way to create a coherence is the use of transitions. What do transitions indicate? Well, there are actually five things they indicate. Well, actually, they're all here. Uh, Although there's more as well. They indicate the introduction of examples. They indicate the move from one object to another in a comparison. If you're comparing two things and you move from one thing to the other, then you need to show that you're moving from one to the other. Same thing with contrast. It's the same principle, only of course you're focusing on differences as opposed to similarities. Sequence, if you are listing, and we saw some examples with that, specifically with the paragraph on the Learning Center, where, or not the paragraph, but yeah, the paragraph on the Learning Center and what and what services it offered. You were just listing, or the writer was just listing the services, so each time there was a new service, he or she added a transitional expression or a transitional word that indicated that there's another piece in a sequence of examples. And then finally, results. In other words, if you are talking about the culmination of something, the effect of something, then you would use some kind of transitional expression to indicate what the result is. Now, with pronouns, if you are going to use pronouns, it's essential that it's clear who or what prior to the pronoun is replacing. That is called the antecedent. So if you talk about my brother Jim, I say, I like my brother Jim. He is a good person. Okay, it's very clear that he is the pronoun replacing the antecedent Jim. Okay, it's very clear there. Now, when you get into more complicated types of writing, sometimes you lose track of the antecedent and the pronoun. Excuse me. Sometimes when you're writing pronouns and you're writing something complex, you lose track of the antecedent. Or rather, you don't pay attention to it because in your head you know what the antecedent is, but the reader may be confused, especially if you're introducing other nouns that could serve as antecedents for the pronoun you've selected. So it becomes very important that you always know, and that the reader always knows, what noun the pronoun is replacing. Now, another thing you can do, to, especially for emphasis, is to repeat key terms. They allow your thoughts to be connected, and I'll give you some examples of that in a moment. And then finally, parallelism, and like I said, that's not something I'm going to focus on because it's more stylistic. It's very effective. Shakespeare uses a great deal in a lot of his soliloquies and a lot of his, in fact, just a lot of his writing, period. But it's a repeated grammatical structure to build coherence. And again, I am not going to make a big deal out of this. I'm much more concerned with the first three types of techniques for coherence on this slide, and then secondarily the repetition of terms. Okay, what we have here is an example of time or chronological order. It's organized according to the sequence of events as they occur in time, and it's the order that is used in narratives, whether they be a narrative essay based on truth or whether they be work of fiction like a novel or a short story. Again, the sentences in blue will indicate the supporting details. The red indicates the subject or topic, and the purple indicates the controlling idea. The yellow indicates transitional expressions that help to move the reader from one event to another. And then finally, the green indicates the concluding sentence of the paragraph. So let's take a look. A black hole in space. That's the subject. From all indications, this is not really a transitional expression, but I added a statement to it. It's a qualifying statement because we know so little about black holes. So basically, the knowledge that the writer is dealing with is knowledge that is subject to change. But from all indications, is the result of a death of the death of a star. I almost said the Death Star, but that would be Star Wars. So, all right. So our first supporting detail: scientists speculate that stars were first formed from the gases floating in the universe at the beginning of time. In the first stage of the life of a star, that's the transition indicating the time order. The hot gas is drawn by gravity into a burning sphere. In the middle stage, there you go. We're moving on to the next moment in time. Our own sun, being a middle-aged star, the burning continues at a regular rate, giving off enormous amounts of heat and light. As it grows old, however, and this is a transition indicating that we're moving into an older time period for the star, the next event, the star eventually explodes to become what is called a nova, a superstar. But gravity soon takes over once again, so the transition here indicates that the next stage is related to the first stage, where we see the hot gas being drawn by gravity. And the exploded star falls back on itself with such a force that all the matter in the star is compacted into a mass no larger than a few miles in diameter. At this point, right, again, transition indicating the circumstances of the last stage. No heavenly body can be seen in that area of the sky, as the tremendous pull of gravity lets nothing escape, not even light. A black hole has thus been formed. Notice the whole point of this is how a black hole is formed, and the concluding statement is a black hole has thus been formed. I could have added thus being result, and maybe I should have, because it is a transitional expression indicating result. So the result of this entire process, this entire sequence of events, is the formation of a black hole. I hope you can see how time order, especially in conjunction with the appropriate transitions, gives this paragraph logical coherence. The next type of order that we'll deal with is space order, or spatial order, which is organized according to spatial direction and is used for physical descriptions. So we have an example here. In this case, there are not really uses of transitional expressions. Rather, the way in which the details of the description of Big Dave, which is our subject, are presented clearly indicate the order, so that transitional expressions are not necessarily needed in this situation. So Big Dave is our subject, was a pure cowboy is the controlling idea. So everything that we find out about Big Dave has to conform to the idea that he is a pure cowboy. So all of the descriptive details need to establish unity, need to describe him as a cowboy. There are many other things perhaps to say about Big Dave, but that's what this paragraph wants to say. In addition to the unity, however, the coherence is essential, and in this case, we're moving from top to bottom. Now, in spatial order, when you're describing something, you don't just have to move from top to bottom. You could move from bottom to top. You could move from left to right, right to left. You could move from outside to inside, or inside to outside. it really doesn't matter so long as where you begin and where you end are clearly in opposition. In other words, if you begin at the top, you have to end at the bottom, and you have to go step by step in that direction. And that's what this writer does. So, he wore a black felt hat so big that it kept his face in perpetual shade. Well, that's his head, so we know we're beginning with the top. Around his neck was knotted a red bandana stained with sweat from long, hot days in the saddle. The neck is down from the head. An oversized blue denim shirt hung from his shoulders, that's down from the neck, to give him plenty of arm freedom, right? That's down from the shoulders. And his faded jeans were held up by a broad leather belt with a huge belt buckle featuring a snorting bronc in full buck, which covers the waist with the belt and the legs with the jeans. His boots, old and dirt-covered, kicked up little dust storms as he sauntered across the corral. And, of course, his boots are on his feet, and so we have ended at the bottom of Big Dave. So I think that's pretty evident. If you are going to describe something, and you may need to either in this class at some future date or in terms of another class, this is the way you would go about describing something physically, how it appears to the eye. All right, and the final order that we're going to cover in this presentation is deductive order. This is the order that, generally speaking, you will be using throughout the semester, more so than the other two. Deductive order moves from a generalization, which would be your topic sentence, to particular details that support the general statement, your evidence or your supporting details. Again, the supporting details are in blue. The topic or the subject is in red, and the controlling idea is in purple. This topic sentence is not as cut and dry as the ones that we've been looking at prior to this, but nevertheless, it is a good topic sentence. It's just taken a little bit of, well, stylistic, don't want to say liberties, but it's a little bit more stylistically sophisticated. Nevertheless, teenagers is clearly the subject, and there's trouble, which is obvious when you read the paragraph, and specifically in spelling and social science. So we're going to see how that works out. So, in a recent experiment, not one of the students tested could write the Pledge of Allegiance correctly. Well, that would be a problem with social science and maybe with spelling. In addition, now here we have our first transition, which indicates the continuation of the sequence. This is something that you will be using if you are engaged in deductive order. The results showed that the students apparently had little understanding of the pledge's meaning. For example, here we go. Your first essay is going to be an exemplification essay, so when you introduce an example in your paragraph, that's what you need to do. For example, several students described the United States as a, quote, nation under guard, unquote, instead of, quote, under God, unquote. And the phrase, to the republic for which it stands, appeared in several responses as of the riches stand or for Richard's stand. Boy, that's pretty bad, isn't it? That's a problem with social science and maybe with spelling as well. Many students changed the word indivisible to the phrase in the visible. And this conjunction here works as a transition indicating the continuation of a sequence. Over 9% of the students, all of whom are Americans from varying racial and ethnic backgrounds, misspelled the word America. There's your problem with spelling. So, this paragraph begins with a general idea about teenagers and trouble with spelling and social science, and then goes through very specific examples of how this is the case. This is a very good paragraph. It is unified in that everything conforms to the subject and the controlling idea, and it is coherent in that All of the details are related to each other logically through the use of transitions. Okay, let's go into a little bit more detail about transitional words and phrases. You can find this information on page 77 of Steps to Writing Well. Again, as I've mentioned before, the transitional words or phrases help the reader move smoothly from one thought to another, and they prevent ideas from appearing disconnected or choppy. And again, I will show you a paragraph without transitions and a paragraph with transitions. As you can see here, there are 6 basic types of transitions that can occur in a paragraph, giving examples, comparison, contrast, sequence, and results. And by the way, that means there are 5 and not 6. Sorry about that. So, words or phrases that you can use when you introduce an example include, but are not limited to, for example, for instance, specifically, in particular, namely, another, other, in addition, and to illustrate. If you are establishing a comparison, which you are not going to be doing in this class, you will be writing a contrast essay, but not a comparison essay. Nevertheless, if you are trying to demonstrate a similarity between 2 subjects and you're moving from one to the other, similarly, not only, but also, and in comparison, will allow you to make that transition smoothly so the reader understands. Contrast has a little bit more, although, but, while, in contrast, however, though, on the other hand, and nevertheless. Learn these very well, because in the contrast essay, it becomes essential that you're using these particular transitional devices. If you're not using them, you are going to lose the reader, which happens to be me. And if you're losing me, then you can imagine that your grade's not going to be that good. So because you're shifting back and forth in a contrast essay between 2 subjects that you're contrasting, it is essential that you indicate to the reader that you're moving from one to the other. Sequence, again, I mentioned just a little while ago, is something you'll use a great deal if you are listing pieces of evidence or supporting details, not necessarily giving examples or making comparison or contrast, but simply adding more pieces of information like we saw with that paragraph about the pledge. First, second, third. Notice it's not firstly or secondly or thirdly. Do not put the ly at the end. It is just first or second or third on down the line. Finally indicates you've reached the final point or final addition you're making in the sequence. Moreover, also, in addition, next, then, after, furthermore, and then previously. Okay, if you're making reference back. And then finally, if you're indicating the result of something, you would use one of the following words: therefore, thus, consequently, or as a result. In the next 2 slides, we're going to look at the same paragraph. In the first instance, we'll see how the paragraph reads without transitional devices. And in the second paragraph, we'll see how it reads with transitional devices and some revision to cut down on the wordiness and the choppiness. So, notice, by the way, this paragraph, and this is from the editors, and I completely agree with it, it sounds choppy and childish. And please pay attention to that word childish. Childish is when you just put things down with no apparent attention to order. Children don't really have a sense of order. Adults do. And so it is essential that not only do you provide the transitions as road signs for your reader so that the reader knows when there's going to be a shift in focus, information, subject, whatever the case may be, but also you want to use these transitions because it makes you sound sophisticated. And sounding sophisticated, not pretentious, mind you, but sophisticated, is essential if you're going to sound convincing. In other words, this kind of basic level of linguistic sophistication, um, how should I say it, makes you sound credible, as though you have some mastery of language, and the assumption is mastery of the ideas that are going into the language. So let's take a look. As you can see, the topic sentences: working in the neighborhood grocery store as a checker. Subject: was one of the worst jobs I've ever had. The controlling idea. Again, the details are in blue. Where we have the yellow is where transitions should be, but they are not. And so I want you to notice, and I'm going to read it to you, but there are three basic pieces of information that are developed in this particular, or three reasons you might say, that are developed in this particular paragraph. The badness of the uniform, the badness of the schedule, and the badness of the workspace. But without transitions, here's how it sounds. I had to wear an ugly, scratchy uniform. It was cut at least 3 inches too short. My schedule of working hours was inconvenient. My hours changed each week. It was impossible to make plans in advance. Getting a day off was out of the question. The lack of workspace bothered me. Except for a half-hour lunch break, I was restricted to 3 square feet of room behind the counter. Oh my God, that sounds awful, doesn't it? It's very choppy. All the sentences are basically the same length. There's no sense of variation, and more importantly, there's no indication that we're moving from uniform to working hours, and from working hours to workspace. And then, of course, the concluding statement is, I felt like a gerbil in a cage. All right, you're going to see that the writer improves that concluding statement, which here is still fairly effective in emphasizing that it was one of the worst jobs the writer has ever had. Okay, here's the same paragraph, but now the writer has introduced transitions to the paragraph, and I think you will see that it is not choppy or disorganized, but rather you can move smoothly from one thought to the next. So we don't need to necessarily break down the topic sentence. We've already encountered it. But look at what the writer does. Working in the neighborhood grocery store as a checker was one of the worst jobs I've ever had. In the first place, I had to wear an ugly, scratchy uniform at least 3 inches too short. My schedule of working hours was another inconvenience. Because my hours changed each week, it was impossible to make plans in advance, and getting a day off was out of the question. In addition, the lack of workspace bothered me. Except for a half-hour lunch break, I was restricted to 3 square feet of room behind the counter, and consequently, I felt as if I were no more than a gerbil in a cage. Now, that is very well written. In many respects, well, there's not much added here. In fact, there's a lot of subtraction. The subtraction actually adds to the effect of the paragraph. Let's look at the transitional expressions very quickly. In the first place, another, in addition, and consequently are our primary transitional words or phrases. The first three indicate sequence because he's adding pieces of information. The last one, it indicates a result, okay, and that's what makes the concluding statement more effective, because it emphasizes that feeling like a gerbil in a cage is the result of all of the details he's told us about this very bad job. In addition, the writer, I say he, it's a she, sorry. The writer uses coordinating conjunctions like and to show addition, and subordinating conjunctions like because to show result, to connect short, choppy, but related sentences to each other. So, for example, we have in the original one, I had to wear an ugly, scratchy uniform. It was cut at least 3 inches too short. Well, you don't need to make those into two different sentences. They both are communicating information about the uniform. So you just need one sentence. You just need a transition too. In the first place, I had to wear an ugly, scratchy uniform at least 3 inches too short, period. Now suddenly we've taken two choppy sentences, combined them, and we've added variation. My schedule of working hours was, again, another inconvenience, instead of just saying it was inconvenient. Um, the previous one, I believe, said my hours changed each week. It was impossible to make plans in advance. Getting a day off was out of the question. Very choppy. Take those three sentences and combine them. Because my hours changed each week, it was impossible to make plans in advance, and getting a day off was out of the question. All of those things, all of those three sentences, if you combine them together, really again, add variety and flow to the paragraph. In addition, the lack of workspace bothered me. Now, it's okay to have a short sentence if it's following up on the heels of two longer sentences. Again, variety. Except for a half-hour lunch break, I was restricted to 3 square feet of room behind the counter, and consequently, I felt as if I were no more than a gerbil in a cage. Okay, so you can see that unnecessary or vague, vague being like, unnecessary, it was cut, have been removed, and the writer has found a way to combine sentences that are related together in ways that allow the paragraph to flow, so that way the reader is not lost and the writer appears to be competent. Okay, here's the same paragraph, but now the writer has introduced transitions to the paragraph, and I think you will see that it is not choppy or disorganized, but rather you can move smoothly from one thought to the next. So we don't need to necessarily break down the topic sentence. We've already encountered it. But look at what the writer does. Working in the neighborhood grocery store as a checker was one of the worst jobs I've ever had. In the first place, I had to wear an ugly, scratchy uniform at least 3 inches too short. My schedule of working hours was another inconvenience. Because my hours changed each week, it was impossible to make plans in advance, and getting a day off was out of the question. In addition, the lack of workspace bothered me. Except for a half-hour lunch break, I was restricted to 3 square feet of room behind the counter, and consequently, I felt as if I were no more than a gerbil in a cage. Now, that is very well written. In many respects, well, there's not much added here. In fact, there's a lot of subtraction. The subtraction actually adds to the effect of the paragraph. Let's look at the transitional expressions very quickly. In the first place, another, in addition, and consequently are our primary transitional words or phrases. The first three indicate sequence because he's adding pieces of information. The last one, it indicates a result, okay, and that's what makes the concluding statement more effective, because it emphasizes that feeling like a gerbil in a cage is the result of all of the details he's told us about this very bad job. In addition, the writer, I say he, it's a she, sorry. The writer uses coordinating conjunctions like and to show addition, and subordinating conjunctions like because to show result, to connect short, choppy, but related sentences to each other. So, for example, we have in the original one, I had to wear an ugly, scratchy uniform. It was cut at least 3 inches too short. Well, you don't need to make those into two different sentences. They both are communicating information about the uniform. So you just need one sentence. You just need a transition too. In the first place, I had to wear an ugly, scratchy uniform at least 3 inches too short, period. Now suddenly we've taken two choppy sentences, combined them, and we've added variation. My schedule of working hours was, again, another inconvenience, instead of just saying it was inconvenient. The previous one, I believe, said my hours changed each week. It was impossible to make plans in advance. Getting a day off was out of the question. Very choppy. Take those 3 sentences and combine them. Because my hours changed each week, it was impossible to make plans in advance, and getting a day off was out of the question. All of those things, all of those 3 sentences, if you combine them together, really, again, add variety and flow to the paragraph. In addition, the lack of workspace bothered me. Now, it's okay to have a short sentence if it's following up on the heels of 2 longer sentences. Again, variety. Except for a half-hour lunch break, I was restricted to 3 square feet of room behind the counter, and consequently, I felt as if I were no more than a gerbil in a cage. Okay, so you can see that unnecessary or vague, vague being like, unnecessary, it was cut, have been removed, and the writer has found a way to combine sentences that are related together in ways that allow the paragraph to flow, so that way the reader is not lost and the writer appears to be competent.